This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
When considering all of the research and some of the insights our team is tracking over the year, the greatest impacts are bucketed under the 6 impact factors, that being population, epidemiology, econ and consumerism, system of care, policy, as well as innovation and technology. A lot of different components go into those 6, but it allows for the forecast to be even more granular than those different care group combinations and service lines and care families.
I'm your host, Trevor DaRin. We have one of our most popular episodes of the year lined up for today, where we run through some of the biggest themes in our annual Impact of Change forecast. And who else could I have on the episode to talk through that but the team that runs building the forecast? And it's a large team with lots of inputs, but these two people are the engine, and that's Tori, Richie, and Danni Park. Thanks so much for joining. This is always a super popular episode because it's connected to one of the big SG2 flagship, if not the flagship product, the Impact of Change forecast. Going through the process, it's fun now because we're out the other side. Tori's rolling her eyes. But what were some of the biggest debates this year, Tori? Things you knew we were going to have to sort out as a team and figure out how they were going to impact the next 10 years of healthcare demand.
There are a couple of areas that immediately come to mind. That's thinking through the timing and impact of clinical advances, thinking when we're really going to be able to scale new pharmaceutical or new therapeutic adoption, when we're going to be able to scale advances in surgical techniques, think minimally invasive surgeries, new surgical capabilities, even thinking through the timing and the impact of those areas is always a really rich conversation with our team of experts. Another major area of debate was around policy, trying to figure out what are the likely impacts that some federal policy changes are going to have on the forecast, what's real versus what's rhetoric, and what are we going to see long-standing within that 10-year timeframe of the forecast, and being really measured in terms of factoring those effects in.
Remind listeners, how do we go through the process of building the forecast? How do we bundle the biggest impacts and make sure that we're coordinated across the 200 diseases and 100 procedures to treat those diseases? How do we think about it? And then we'll break down some of the biggest conclusions, patterns within each of those factors.
Danni, you want to take that one?
When considering all of the research and some of the insights our team is tracking over the year, the greatest impacts are really bucketed under the 6 impact factors, that being population, epidemiology, econ and consumerism, system of care, policy, as well as innovation and technology. A lot of different components go into those 6, but it allows for the forecast to be even more granular than those different care group combinations and service lines and care families.
We have a team of around 30 experts that are considering not only what are those disease and procedure drivers of care demand and utilization, but breaking things down into how do we bucket the stories across those 6 impact factors. It's a culmination of well over 10,000 hours of research and development for our annual refresh each year.
It only feels like 10,000 to Tori and Danni.
It feels like I put in 10,000 alone. That's an underestimate of how much time is going into the development of the forecast on an annual basis.
Let's start with population. Any modeling, population is a huge piece. Talk about some of the biggest trends that POP's going to be the driver of.
Population stems from our demographic data, which we outsource to a third party from Claritas. And what we see in the population data, and this should be a surprise to absolutely no one, is the aging population is what's driving the growth of population, what demographics are growing within the US, but really where is demand growing across the care continuum? To a large degree, it's stemming from that aging patient population. Over 50% of inpatient discharges are going to stem from that 65 up cohort by the end of this decade. And what that says to me is, number one, how are we going to care for this growing bolus of individuals that likely have very complex needs? They're likely experiencing multiple comorbidities that need to be managed. But number two, who the heck is going to care for them? Because if the other age cohorts population is staying relatively stagnant or flat in comparison, that makes me concerned about how are we actually going to staff our traditional care models? How are we going to ensure access to folks to have their conditions managed. And I think underscores the importance of redesigning care pathways, becoming a bit more innovative, a bit more strategic in terms of how we're going to market and how we're building out care and clinical capacity in a way that's different from our traditional workforce model.
When we took a look at each of the service lines, we found that the 18 and up cohort varies in terms of growth over the 10 years, but the substantial growth and consistent growth is going to be happening with that 65 and up cohort across all the service lines. Not just a few selective ones need to really consider this. It's across the board. How is care going to be delivered for that population?
All right, pop the baseline. Now let's talk about the fun ones where there's more debate. Tori, talk policy first. You mentioned it right off the bat. A lot of room for speculation, but we had to quantify it. Where do we make our bets?
We took a very balanced approach to thinking through policy impacts. And because there is so much room for speculation, we tried to not speculate. Essentially, if there is not federal policy in place to execute on certain measures, we're not incorporating them into the forecast. That's where layering on scenario modeling to push up or pull down utilization in more specific areas, that's going to be more important. That's going to allow us to drill in nuance as we learn more, as we consider localized impacts for policy measures. But some things that we took into consideration are things like site neutrality. How might care delivery change if site neutrality scales and goes into effect? And that certainly was a consideration when balancing inpatient versus outpatient surgical procedure growth. Things like the CMS team model and how that might affect growth in the outpatient setting for a select subset of procedures. But we also debated things like research funding or HHS transformation and how that might affect the types of services, the types of clinical trials that are taking place, and whether there are downward pressures on some of the utilization that we've seen in major research areas, think cancer, for example. Those were some of the main areas of debate. We worked closely with not only experts across Sg2 intelligence, but with our partners in DC, the Vizient policy team, to understand where should we drive alignment, where can we make sure that we're considering what is real and likely going to have a lasting effect over the coming decade.
One of the impact factors that can feel academic, but is also super interesting and the place a lot of us spend time and energy is epidemiology. Which trends, patterns that we were paying attention to were big enough and clear enough that they made it into the forecast?
Chronic disease is always a big one. That's an area where we just continue to see increased incidence and prevalence within the population. And we as communities are not healthier now than we were 10 years ago. And short of something substantial changing, perhaps GLP-1s are going to take off and affect prevalence for unique conditions, but we're not there yet. That hasn't scaled. That's going to take a lot of time to transform from an epidemiological perspective, the health and well-being of communities. So we continue to expect growth in that area. There's also an element, and behavioral health is such a good example of this, increased awareness of certain conditions. Because we know to look for certain things, we're going to find it more often. Because we know in annual wellness and screening visits to go through a mental health and wellness check, we're more likely to then flag an individual for a behavioral health condition. That's another major driver of some of the increases that we see in that impact factor. Sure, there are environmental factors that are causing an increase in prevalence, but there's also this element of increased screening, which is going to yield increased findings. Another good example of that is cancer. When we think about regular screenings for select cancer types, we're going to see increased findings because our technology is just getting much more sensitive. We're becoming smarter about how we're performing those screenings and when. There's a delicate balance
because this
there
is the fun, hard stuff when we get into forecasting. Is a better cancer screening just finding it earlier, or is it finding more of them?
We want to find them in both cases, but certainly the earlier, the better. If we're doing regular screening and we're finding them sooner, then we're more likely to have increases and improvement in survivorship. What is incredibly concerning to me is when we think about the rise in cancer incident for young adults, we're hearing a lot about an increase in gastrointestinal cancers in young adults. And this is an area where we're not screening a younger patient population. You're not getting your first colonoscopy when you're 35 years years old. So by the time disease is found in that patient population, it's because they're symptomatic and the cancer has had a chance to spread. That's where it is figuring out the right balance of, we probably don't want to have everybody do an annual CT or PET scan and find every incidental finding, but we need to then find the balance of how do we improve screening, especially in younger populations, to find illness in earlier stages so we
that
give
makes
folks
sense.
a better
And
chance
the way
of
the math
survival.
works in my brain, because it's a 10-year horizon, finding stuff earlier means we're going to find stuff that would have been outside of that 10-year horizon in a previous forecast version.
Think of it as a hamster wheel. Once you're on the hamster wheel, you're on the hamster wheel for life. It's pretty hard to get off of it because you're then going in for regular and routine screenings for years, if not decades to come. The likelihood of then finding something else down the road increases because you're subjecting yourself to additional screenings, which is great. We absolutely want to do all that we can to prevent disease progression in folks. But when we think about then what that means from a sheer volume generation perspective, that means that we're cranking up utilization
You talked
over
about
time by
site
doing that
neutrality,
approach.
which obviously falls into our system of care factor, thinking about where care is going to be delivered. Talk about a couple other pieces that have been recurring themes the last several forecasts, and I'm sure showed up here. Change in care at home, up to and including virtual care patterns.
Within the next decade, substantial growth, over 30% for care at home or like those post-acute care services. It's been a topic of conversation in the past years, and maybe that handoff between inpatient and these outpatient settings have been weak, or in terms of getting them to the home setting. With the substantial growth, the opportunities and the really high growth financial investments or returns in the long term are very much like top of mind and should be very considered. Reimagining how this care orchestration is really going to be taking place is important for health systems to understand what are the investments, what are the partnerships that they have in place or need to put into place to be able to maintain and manage the care for these patients and consumers, but also helping the consumers navigate the care continuum and system to support each other in maybe a more symbiotic way.
And Danni, when we think about the potential that partnerships have to transform care delivery, health systems do not need to go at things alone. Our recommendation is not that you need to scale an entire post-acute infrastructure using resources that exist within your healthcare system, but to think creatively, strategically about what community-based partners or even national partners exist to allow you to improve that care coordination so that you're opening access across the care continuum while also operating more efficiently, working to preserve and maintain some level of capacity across those acute care sites, because you're going to need those beds. You're going to need to get people processed and worked through the care continuum much more efficiently in the future.
I've heard from members, they're bullish on demand here and think that they can get the logistics and operations there to match demand in a way that I hadn't heard just a year or two ago. Big programs today are in the teens in terms of average daily census, but I've heard them say, we think there's demand to get to 100 ADC a day, and that's not going to happen in a year. But if the advanced programs can get there, it says a lot about the proportion of care that can move that way. So I'm excited that we're bullish too. Talk about consumerism and econ. Another place probably ripe for speculation, but I'm sure we don't speculate too much. What are the big things we're paying attention to?
Big things that we're paying attention to are finding the signals amongst the noise. So something that we considered quite a bit was the budget reconciliation and what is likely to happen in terms of number of enrolled lives in programs like Medicaid and the marketplace exchanges, and how attrition is likely to then affect care utilization patterns. And if we see that attrition, we recognize that demand for price-sensitive services, care that's often deferred or delayed because of access and cost barriers, we're likely to see attrition in that area. Top conditions include things like pain management, behavioral health, chronic disease management, annual wellness screenings, and the like. Those are the types of services that folks are possibly going to go without or have less of because they are uninsured or underinsured. So that was a major consumerism story. Another one that we put quite a bit of thought into is how direct-to-consumer care models are changing consumer patterns. We really see that trend taking off and scaling in the orthopedics area, thinking about how PT and OT services are being performed, where they're being performed, and how consumers are accessing them.
We continue to find too that from consumer behavior that consumers seek care across a variety of different systems. So it's fragmented and there's no true hub for them or like a primary location for them to be receiving the care. So they'll shop around and really find the best fit depending on the services that they're looking for.
Last one that's always a big piece, and another area where there's a lot of potential inputs is innovation and tech. Which things are we paying closest attention to? Is this where something like GLP-1s, and you mentioned clinical and pharma scale and timing, a lot of that falls in this bucket?
Because the scaling of GLP-1s is still relatively new, that is a story that for now is housed in our in-tech impact factor. Over time, we can make the debate of does that story shift elsewhere? I'm sure with our team, there will be a number of debates. But for now, yes, that is something that is embedded within the in-tech impact factor. And that affects the conditions that come top of mind, type 2 diabetes, obesity. But we're increasingly seeing expanded indications for these drugs that are hitting cardiovascular conditions, things like sleep apnea as well. Over the last few weeks, we've come across medical journals that show expanded indications for kidney and liver disease, as well as a few different types of cancer. Starting to embed this GLP-1 story into those forecasts is exciting to think about how we might then change disease progression or disease management beyond just endocrinology and primary care. Other specialties are getting into the game, which is really cool. That was a major area of modeling that the team undertook, but we're thinking of a variety of other innovations as well. There was a lot of debate around how is AI going to transform care delivery? Are we going to have robots in the rooms? And that is not a story that made it into the forecast. That's on the cutting room floor. But what we did talk about is how is AI going to make care delivery more efficient? And is that then going to allow organizations to see more patients in future years than they're able to today? The resounding response was absolutely. And that's something that we need to be considering as we think about optimizing and innovating on those care delivery models. Surgical advances is another one. Everything from minimally invasive surgical techniques scaling to new surgical capabilities. We talk a lot about what new capabilities are coming onto the market that just simply did not exist previously. This is a niche example, but I just learned that organizations like Ohio State are performing vocal cord transplants using Gore-Tex capabilities. So when we think about the capabilities that exist today to treat people that have perhaps lost their voice, can't swallow, have breathing issues, and previously they didn't have access to very many interventions, as we continue pushing the needle, those are then surgical capabilities that are going to scale over the coming decade. Other pharmaceutical innovation include things like gene therapies and personalized medicine for cancer patients or for patients that are experiencing conditions like sickle cell, thinking through and being able to scale therapeutic techniques that allow us to perform gene sequencing, perhaps even change the DNA of diseased cells in the body, and then be able to treat and cure patients altogether of conditions. These are things that are niche, and the number of patients we're able to treat per year is still quite small. But over the coming decade, that's going to continue to grow, and that's going to then yield additional care utilization as we have to manage those patients longitudinally.
Any stories within that, diseases or procedures that got multiple accelerators because they hit a bunch of these factors all at once? Any highlights that pop to you in the forecast like, wow, this one really hits all those stories?
This goes back to the GLP-1s. For chronic cardiovascular patients, what we're seeing is this evolution of evidence-based medicine where these chronic care patients are being managed using combination therapies of the GLP-1s and SGLT2 inhibitors to manage their chronic conditions, but then improve their health long-term. That's an interesting one where they're not mutually exclusive. You can layer on these drugs and these care pathway evolutions to improve the health of the patient and think about them in more than just a transactional sense.
That's a great thought to wrap on. What we're going to do next is have a deep conversation about each one of these impact factors, and Tori's going to lead those. We'll bring in some of our service line experts who think about how those factors make a huge impact on the diseases, patients within their service line. So many more debates and conversations to come on the podcast about these topics. Danni and Tori, thanks so much for the overview. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us. and or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at Sg2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, Sg2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You could find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.